So we are going to talk about Matthew Arnold today and his next essay, which is the part of your Unit 4, which is again very much a kind of shift from the previous units. Now the previous units talked about the poetic theories of various authors and poets that existed in different epochs, in different eras. And this is a complete shift in its thought and its intent. Why? Because here the focus is entirely on the criticism part. So what about those poetic theories that were written or that was ultimately seen as poetic doctrines? How well they were received, or how well or how critically they were received by certain critics of the age? And what exactly used to be the function of criticism during the 17th and 18th century, especially 1800, post-1800 and post-Romantic era, especially in the Victorian times? So in this particular essay, The Function of Criticism at the Present Time by Matthew Arnold, we'll see and talk about the ultimate role and functions of criticism, and why this essay particularly, which is quite simple and quite to an extent self-explanatory, why this particular essay talks about the relevance and need for applying the right framework of literary criticism. So let's begin with a brief introduction of Matthew Arnold. So Arnold, who was born in the year 1822, he was an eminent literary figure. He was a poet, a critic, and he basically made his mark in his own time as almost an apostle of culture. As a poet, he was very much in its inclinations like Thomas Gray and did not quite speak out as freely as poets of the other times have done. And as a critic, he was ranked, and he was usually seen as one of the greatest critics of all time. He was kept next to Dryden, to Johnson, to Coleridge, and later on in modern times we had Eliot. So it is principally as a critic that he is remembered in the present times. Now, as I said, he was born in the year 1822. He was next to Tennyson and Browning, if we compare him, or if we place him particularly in the Victorian literary figures. And likewise, he was also regarded as a classist and a pessimist. Classist because in its ability to deal with poetry, he was very much classist, but at the level of expression, how he expressed himself at the level of thought, he was quite a pessimist. About his education, he studied at Oxford and was even later appointed as the inspector of schools in 1851. And during this time of inspectorateship, he was also a professor of poetry at Oxford, and it was during this time that he wrote some of the best pieces of the essays, that is the critical pieces, and the important one is the Essay of Criticism, that is a collection of various essays written in 1857. One of them we are going to study today in detail. So the period of his professorship at Oxford was from 1857 to 67 for the year of 10 years. And he came up with the prefaces to the first and second editions of the Essays in Criticism, that's the important work, Essays in Criticism, in 1853. And it came up as two series. So the Essays in Criticism that we are going to deal today, the part of which, that is the function of criticism at the present times, it was very much the part of the Essays in Criticism that appeared in 1865. And as the first collection of critical writing, it was quite an important work. Why it was important? Because it primarily dealt with Matthew Arnold's interpretation of criticism and his own critique, his critique of writers who write politically or religiously biased literature, and therefore he felt that they narrowed somewhere, they limited somewhere the source of poetic subject or the scope of writing poetry in a manner. Now, before we jump on to analyzing the propositions that he made in the essay, The Functions of Criticism in the Present Times, it is important that we have some idea, that we get some understanding of his views on the poetic credo, his poetic credo, the basic poetic theories, what he meant by these conjectures of poetic theories, how he viewed poetry in general. Now, he said that poetry was a criticism of life. Poetry was a vehicle for the poet's view of the world, his outlook on the life, his philosophy, his moral teaching. So in his view, he was strongly influenced by the classical writers. He was inspired from the Greek masters, from Homer, from Sophocles, from Epictetus, from these Greek masters who saw life steadily and saw it as a complete entity, as a whole. So for Arnold, a poem should treat the subject as a whole, as a complete entity in itself, in order to produce that profound truth, or in order to produce that one profound moral impression. He condemned the romantic poets, the tendency of the romantic poets when they use some purple patches or some stray and sudden outbursts of splendor, which he said that they somewhere distracted the attention of the form, or from the poem as a whole. And the subjects of poetry, he says that, and that's the same, he said it in the preface, he said that should be the actions, the human actions possessing an inherent interest in themselves, which are to be communicated in the most interesting manner by the art of the poet. So Arnold possessed both the critical faculty, and an important critical faculty, and the poetic impulse. Please remember that a poet is essentially a critic. A critic may not be essentially a poet, but a poet is essentially, inevitably, a critic at some time. And theories that emanates from the mind, and poetry is something which emanates from the heart. And apart from this, he was quite a great admirer of Goethe and Wordsworth, and he even mentions both of them and precisely uses both of their poetic theories in his own essay. And why he preferred these two, or why he was quite an admirer of these two figures, because there was this element of profoundness, high seriousness that he found, which was something incomparable to other literary figures of his age. So the function of criticism, and this applies largely to all branches of knowledge. Broadly, he gave up this definition, this explanation of what criticism was, or what's the essential function of criticism was. He said the function of criticism in his sense was, and I'm quoting from the text here, and it is, and I quote, a disinterested endeavor to learn and propagate the best that is known and taught in the world, and thus to establish a current of fresh and true ideas. Let me repeat it again. The function of criticism is, in his sense, as per this man's view, is a disinterested endeavor to learn and propagate the best that is known and taught in the world, and thus to establish a current of fresh and true ideas. Unquote. So here I have the text. So let's begin with the textual reading. He begins by saying that of the literature of France and Germany, as of the intellect of Europe in general, the main effort for now many years has been a critical effort, the endeavor in all branches of knowledge, theology, philosophy, history, art, science, to see the object as in itself it is. To see the object as in itself it really is. So what does this mean? Here he means that the basic task of any critic, according to Arnold, is to perceive that particular object as it is, the way it exists, without thinking about or without adding on to other extraneous conditions. For him, the text should be the whole, the text should be the primary entity in itself, and a critic should never take the help of any other text for its explanation. He says to see the object as in itself it really is. So before jumping onto or before explaining the particular text or viewing the particular text from the different points of reference, or by bringing different element of intertextuality, one must view the object, that is art object or the literary object, as in itself it really is, without having analysis of in which particular conditions it emerged, what was its context in which the poet or the writer or the author wrote it. So whether that particular thing that is being said, it is true, valid piece of art or not, that is the primary contention. In simple words, if Newton had proposed a theory about, say, gravitational pull, so first, instead of analyzing what's the background of this man, was he educated enough to make an interpretation about gravity or such kind of astronomical innovations or not, or any element of cosmology, it's important that what was his idea? His idea was when the apple fell from the tree, it was due to the gravitational force. So he was talking of a particular theory of gravitational force, and he elaborated. So instead of focusing on his background or on his context or in which conditions he explained this particular theory or he originated this idea, let's first focus on the object in itself as it really is. And the very next line he says, and he, in a way, in the next line, he condemns the false criticism. Why? He condemns a false criticism because which is something which is not original, or which is biased, which is marred by a number of juicy prejudices. Then it is not to be regarded as a reliable sort of a criticism. He says in the next line, creative activity is the true function of man. Creative effort is the true function of man. Now you'll notice throughout this essay, there is this dichotomy of which one is superior, the critical faculty or the creative faculty, the power of imagination or the power to view things in its rationality. Now, the critical faculty essentially takes into account the idea of rationality. It essentially takes into account the ability to reason out the ability of ratiocination, and also some of the aspects of pragmatism. So the idea is the critical faculty essentially uses the foundation of reason. Again, we go back to the dichotomy that was created by, not just created, it was raised up by Shelley in his essay of reason versus imagination, and he clearly said that imagination is way ahead, way more superior than to the reason. The fact that we are able to reason out something is primarily because we imagined it in the first place, and we started out giving reason to it secondly. So reason will always be secondary and tertiary in its importance as compared to imagination. Why? Because the critical faculty, the faculty to reason out, to rationalize things, always uses some of the evidence. It is based on facts and testimonies, right? Something which only the naked eye see. What about the things that the naked eye cannot see? Does they not exist? But imagination can make them exist. So it is true that creative activity is the true. Now, if you're aware of a particular movement, formalist movement in literary theory that dominated the American literary criticism in the middle of 20th century, it is the new criticism. This new criticism emphasized close reading of the text. This new criticism emphasized that in order to discover a work of literature, it should be seen first of all as a self-contained object, as a self-referential aesthetic object. It is complete in itself. It does not need any background or any contextual reading for that matter. So somewhere the emergence of the new criticism, which emerged around the middle decades of the 20th century, they had its origins, they had its conformity from the works of Matthew Arnold, especially when he says this line, that all effort of criticism must be to see the objects as they really are. And in the next line, important line, he says, that is, I am talking of this, there is this inherent superiority of the creative effort of the human spirit over the critical effort. So I mentioned about two faculties, creative faculties and critical faculties, and he says, and it is pretty much obvious that there is this inherent superiority of creative faculty over the critical faculty. Why that happens? This particular question, I leave it to all the students, because this is particularly explained very well by Shelley in his essays, and this was one of the debates he even took up between reason and imagination. So you have to tell me what was the cause of it. This will be more like a recuperation. Moving on to the next line, he says that Wordsworth has this critical power very low, and his ability to be, and this power of criticism Wordsworth has, it is even lower than the inventive power. Inventive means being innovative, being imaginative. So clearly he's stating, as I said earlier too, he praised and admired Goethe and Wordsworth both, and he felt this power of innovation, this power of imagination, virtuoso, was, or this skillful unusualness, this was very much the part of Wordsworth's poetic credo. However, he was not a very good critic. And let's read it further. Wordsworth holds the critical power very low, infinitely lower than the inventive, and he said today that if the quantity of time consumed in writing critiques on the work of others were given to original composition of whatever kind it may be, it would be much better employed. It would make a man find out sooner his own level. It would do infinitely less mischief. So the degree and amount of time that one wastes in being critical of someone's work and employing themselves as to be the real critics, they who regard themselves as the professional critics, that is something they are doing great mischief. And if they employed these energies to creating original work, it would be much better. Why? Because a false and malicious criticism may do much injury to the minds of others. However, a stupid invention, so anything which is imaginary, ingenuous, even if it is stupid, either in prose or verse, is at least it is harmless as compared to a false and malicious criticism. So clearly a false criticism which is not original, or it is biased, or it is marred by some sort of prejudices, or has a partisan outlook overall, he believed that the creator of a text is far more greater than its critic. Why? Because ultimately creative activity is the true function of man, and it is true that the critic which is existing outside, he ultimately picks out or draws the true meaning of that particular work of literature. But a false criticism does more harm than any stupid invention. Then on the same page, he questioned some of the past critics and imagines that that is it not true that Johnson had been better on producing more of his creative work rather than writing lives of poets, or Wordsworth himself was better employed in making the sonnets and composing poems near the beautiful sceneries, and he might not have been simply celebrated while he was attempting the preface, which was full of criticism of the works of others. So he is primarily known for the element of profundity he brought to his poetry rather than a critical piece called preface, right? So he said that, of course, there is no doubt in it that the critical power is of lower rank than the creative one. So on the next page, he says, what is it that constitute the emergence of these creative powers? So I'm reading from here. Another is, that is, the exercise of the creative power is the production of great works of literature or art. However high this exercise of it may rank, it is not that all epochs and under all conditions possible, and that therefore labor must be vainly spent in attempting it, while might with more fruit be used in preparing for it, in rendering it possible. He's simply questioning why is the case that not every age has Shakespeare, or not every age has some of the other legendary people like Goethe or Wordsworth themselves. The reason is because that not every age has right kind of circumstances in which these poets write or they compose their artistic work or aesthetic work. Now, this is, don't you think this is a kind of contradiction to what he previously said? He said the focus of the critic should be the object in itself. That is, the part of, the duty of, the role of, or the function of the critic. Now I'm talking of why Shakespeare never existed in all epochs or all ages, and why is the case that all centuries do not have one Shakespeare of their own? It is because the reason he gives is the creative power works with elements, with materials, and if those elements and those materials are not existing, they may not produce a great work of art, rather they may put their labor somewhere else too, which may not be as great as the other aesthetic goodness that exists, but certainly contributing to that particular age of literature. In simple words, if I describe what he's trying to draw as his point on this particular page, he says that all these great pieces of art, all these great literature, especially the fact that there is only one Shakespeare in the Elizabethan times, and the time that there has been just one Homer that had existed in centuries, they all exist because the condition in which they wrote, the atmosphere in which they wrote, was such that it contributed harmoniously to their creative faculty of mind. So, when it comes to composition, yes, it is necessary that the best of literatures should not really focus itself on writing of the political times or of the religious turmoil, or or for that matter the poet's own point of view on a particular religion or any other, say, political matter. Rather, a particular aesthetic or a piece of art is great when it is free from all these political, religious and other such influences. And how can that be possible? Only when you're at peace with yourself, inside and outside. If you think that there is some turmoil going out, some kind of civil unrest going on in a particular country, in a particular area, do you think the writer and the poet can be at harmony, at some sort of harmony with himself? No, he cannot be, because outside the circumstances may not be very well enough so that he can come up with his own creation which is free from these influences. Rather, he can write this great piece of work of art only when the outside situations, the outside conditions are harmonious. The best of the times exist. So Homer wrote this primarily because he was in the Greco-Roman times, when it was seeing art in its full form, when it was enjoying its course of civil life from all directions, from all course of actions. And Shakespeare wrote so because Elizabethan times, during those 14th, 15th century, they were not 14th, but 15th, 16th century, they were enjoying the fruits of what Queen Elizabeth gained, right? And the simple argument, so what about if I, as student, if this question comes up, it is agreed that a great piece of work of art is created when there is harmony outside, or when the outside conditions are such that it produces a kind of harmony in the poet's mind, or in the writer's mind, in the author's mind, and as a result of this, the work of art is directly free from political or religious or other biases, and as a result, it focuses only on aesthetics, nothing else but the aesthetics, right? So there is nothing of a political ideology reflected in that piece, or religious ideology, only of aesthetics has been talked about. What about those writers or those authors who have taken birth in such times where there is civil unrest, or the outside atmosphere may not be as harmonious as it is expected? So here, Mr. Arnold says what his suggestion is, here that is why this whole idea, this whole gamut of reading a lot of books comes up. And this is where he even directly accuses Wordsworth that Mr. Wordsworth, you haven't read much. You haven't read much, and as a result, your poetry reflects so. Now you can raise, as students, you can raise the question, what is the purpose of reading? He says that those who do not have any harmony outside in their context, in their surroundings, and they're trying to compose something as poets and writers, what they can do is, they can, by reading a huge number of books, by reading of the things of the past literature, they can at least create that harmony, that idea of harmony inside their minds, inside their brains, while having a good readability of a number of books. So a poet may simply say, an author may simply ask, is it my fault that if I'm not born in the right circumstances, or if I'm born in the times of crisis? He simply says, in such state of things, the true basis for the creative power is they must find such data, such materials, such readings, so that by reading this material, he's able to construct a kind of semblance in his own mind. Now let's continue with the same idea that I explained, something which Arnold proposed in the first place, that for an artist to have his own literary fruition, for an artist to have his complete literary ingenuity, or particularly the literary genius to emerge, he or she must have, in this case, they must have this synthesis of intellectual and spiritual atmosphere outside. Now let's make the reading. So we'll begin from here. Now in literature, I'll limit myself to literature. Now in literature, I will limit myself to literature, for it is about literature that the question arises. The elements which the creative power works are ideas, and the best ideas on every matter which literature touches current at the time. At any rate, we may lay it down as certain that in modern literature, no manifestation of the creative power not working with these can be very important or fruitful. At any rate, we may lay it down as certain that in modern literature, no manifestation of creative power not working with these can be important. So if whatever creative powers, or what it simply means, aesthetic works that we find, if they are not conforming to these ideas, they do not, or they cannot be regarded as aesthetic pieces in the first place. As I say, current at the time, not merely accessible at the time, for creative literary genius does not principally show itself in discovering new ideas. That is rather the business of the philosopher. So the role or the job of a philosopher is to come up with different discoveries, to think of new ideas, to think about or to rationalize whatever is going around by means of theorizing. But this is not the job of the poet or the writer or the creative genius. Rather, creative genius does not principally show itself in discovering new ideas. They're not supposed to discover new ideas. Rather, they have to use these new ideas in a form of, or as a work of synthesis and exposition, not of analysis and discovery. So the grand work of literary genius is a work of synthesis and exposition. Synthesis and exposition of the new ideas that are taking shape in the time, not of the analysis and discovery. You're not supposed to word by word or rationally or with the use of reason deduct these theories. Rather, you have to think of imagination, and with the use of imagination and exposition of these new ideas, the synthesis of an exposition, the synthesis of imagination and exposition of these new ideas that philosophy or other rational school of thought proposes, you have to bring these two as together, and only then the grand work of literary genius can emerge, right? So let me reread it. The grand work of literary genius is a work of synthesis and exposition, not of analysis and discovery. Its gift lies in the faculty of being happily inspired by a certain intellectual and spiritual atmosphere, by a certain order of ideas when it finds itself in them, of dealing divinely with these ideas when it finds itself in them, of dealing divinely with these ideas, presenting them in the most effective and attractive combination. For the simple example, if I take, by a certain order of ideas when it finds itself in them, of dealing divinely with these ideas. So for example, when Renaissance came up, that is when the idea of that cosmology is not just limited to only two planets, whether sun is revolving around earth or earth is revolving around sun. No, we are also in touch with multiple other levels of planets that exist at different positions in the solar system. So this was clearly a new idea. Now he says this is the business of a rationalist to find out, a mathematician, an astronomer, an astrologer, or an astronaut to find out how many planets exist or what exactly is the position of these planets in the solar system. the duty of the poet is, the duty of a literary artist is, what is their duty? Their duty is to deal with these divinely new ideas and present them in the most effective and attractive combinations. Now think of the metaphysical poets. Think of these poets, for example, John Donne, Crashew. Now these were the poets who presented the simple ideas of love, of being with their beloved in the most exquisite manner. How? They used all those new discoveries of whatever, of astronomy, of cosmology, of various sea routes or other land discoveries that were happening during those times. The nations were getting discovered, new sea routes were found from Britain to these places so that trades can be set up. So all these outside incidents, they found these new ideas, which is the business of a rationalist, be it a mathematician, be it a philosopher, be it a astronomer, be it a cosmologist. These new ideas, and the duty of, where does this duty of poet or literary artist comes up? When they deal with these new ideas divinely, of dealing divinely with these ideas, presenting them in the most effective and attractive combinations. She is all nations and all princes I, making beautiful works with them, in short. But it must have the atmosphere, it must find itself amid the order of ideas in order to work freely. And these it is not easy to command. Why? Because this is why great creative epochs in literature are so rare. Now he talks of creative epochs. Till now we have seen that great pieces of art or great works of art have been talked of. He says more rare than these great pieces of work of art is the creative epochs. And what all creative epochs he is mindful of? He remembered the times of Shakespeare as to be a greatest epoch. He is remembered to having Homer's time as to be the greatest creative epochs. The Greco-Roman times when tragedies flourished, or when poets like Virgil came up, these were the creative epochs in literature. So he's talking of creative epochs. And what is that creative epoch? Best creative epochs is when that particular epochs find its most intellectual and spiritually stimulating atmosphere for a literary artist to compose his own piece of work. When that creative ingenuity is maximum, partly because of his own ingenuity, because of his own imagination, and partly because this intellectual and spiritual atmosphere that exists outside, that order of things that exist outside, which provide a kind of harmony outside, right? So if you theorize it, think of theorizing the same thing yourself. How would you say? Now I made 2 points. I simply said that one that is required is the imagination of the man, and another thing that is required is the harmony outside, right? So So Arnold here, he coined of these two words, the power of man and the power of the moment. His theorization included these two parts, that is the power of, and I'm reading from here. This is why great creative epochs in literature are so rare. This is why there is so much that is unsatisfactory in the production of many men of real genius. Because for the creation of a masterpiece, for the creation of a masterwork of literature, two powers are required. One is the power of the man, that is the individual ingenuity, the imaginative ingenuity, the distinctive individuality at the level of imagination that is required of any artist. And second, the power of the moment, that is the atmosphere in which he or she is able to compose. He only, because we are talking of largely literary artists, is equal to men of those age. So the power of the moment, that is the intellectual and spiritual atmosphere outside. So two powers must conquer, the power of the man and the power of the moment. And the man is not enough without the moment. The creative power has for its happy exercise appointed elements, and those elements are not in its own control.